Yes, so welcome everyone. You're probably aware that within benefit cost analysis, there are a range of relatively tricky or controversial issues that people talk about quite a bit, including issues around discounting and issues around how you handle distributional consequences and whether or not you should include the excess burden of taxation in your calculations. But I'm not talking about any of those. I'm talking about something that probably isn't seen as being controversial, but is the subject of a lot of confusion. So, and it's about the decision criteria that we use in benefit cost analysis. This paper has a long genesis period. It started about 12 years ago. I was doing a lot of benefit cost analysis work, and I had a debate with Graham Marshall from the University of New England, who's the second one on the screen there, about the correct way to calculate a benefit cost ratio. And this debate went on and on and on, like basically for a month. And we went back and forwards dozens of times, and it forced us to really test our understanding of what we were talking about. And we built lots of simulation models and eventually optimization models, and came out of that with both of us with a much better understanding of when and how you would use BCRs and how you should calculate them. And Michael Burton, in the middle of that, is on the screen because he played a really decisive role in that. He sort of stepped in when we were really bogged down and said, this is how you could sort this out, gave us some advice on a way of modelling it, and that really solved our problem. Next on the screen there is Abby. So within my team at UWA, I sort of shared the insights that came out of that experience, and Abby and others have used those in their work. Abby used it in something she wrote, which eventually got reviewed externally by Tom Compass, who's the last one on the screen. And Tom came back and says, no, that's wrong. And so Tom and I got into a debate about what was right and wrong. And fairly quickly, I was able to convince Tom that no, actually, the textbook that he'd been relying on was wrong. And so Abby said, well, this is crazy. There's other textbooks and guidelines out there that are also wrong. Why don't we write a paper to sort of, or something to try and set this straight? And that sort of evolved into this presentation, which will eventually become a paper. So I'll start with some really basics. So as I'm sure everyone in the room and online would be aware, that there's a range of decision criteria or decision rules that are available when you do a benefit cost analysis. Net present value, which is the difference between the present value of benefits and costs. Benefit cost ratio, which is the same numbers, but the ratio of them. And the internal rate of return, which is the discount rate at which the net present value equals 0, are the three most commonly used and discussed. There are actually some others as well, but I'll stick to those three for this purpose. And, you know, as I've sort of hinted already, when you look at textbooks and government guidelines that give advice about which of these to use, they vary. In fact, they vary quite a lot, surprisingly a large amount. And so there's an obvious observation from that, which is that they can't all be right because they're directly in contradiction with each other sometimes. So that's sort of the starting point. Another observation is that this confusion and disagreement is quite surprising, because BCA is probably the most widely used economic tool in the world. And we think of its purpose as being to guide decision making. But so therefore getting these decision criteria right is pretty basic. It's pretty fundamental to what you're going to get out of having used a benefit cost analysis. If you don't get the decision criteria right, then why did you bother? The other reason that's a bit surprising is that the right information is out there. There are publications that do give really good and reasonably comprehensive advice about which criteria to use, including some that are really old. This is one from 1955, which correctly breaks down the issue into the right sort of categories that I'm going to talk about in a minute, and gives accurate advice about each of the categories that it looks at. It doesn't cover all the scenarios that I'll look at, but what it does cover, it covers correctly. But since then, as I say, the advice has been somewhat inconsistent and sometimes wrong. So if I say something's wrong, how am I judging? What's right then? How do I decide what's right? So I'm going to assert, and we can have a debate about this later if you like, that what we're trying to do when we make decisions as a result of a benefit cost analysis is make the decision that would maximise the overall net present value. Right? That's the criteria that we would like to go for. It doesn't necessarily mean that we use the net present value as our decision rule in every case, but whatever we use, the outcome should be in the long run to maximise the overall net present value. And that's going to be true for different types of decisions because BCA is used in a variety of different contexts. So for example, we could be asking the question, should I fund this individual project? So in other words, the question there is, will it increase the overall BCA net present value? Or we could be asking, which one of this set of mutually exclusive projects should I fund? They're mutually exclusive, so you can only fund one of them. Which one? So you're trying to find the one that provides the greatest net present value. Or you could be asking, which subset of projects out of this long list of potential projects should I fund? And so which subset delivers the greatest aggregate net present value? So you're looking at sort of like a portfolio type decision there. So what the reason that some people go astray, some textbooks and some guidelines go astray, is that they don't recognise that the best decision rule or the best decision criterion depends on a couple of, or actually several possible circumstances. I'm going to talk about two initially. The first set of circumstances is whether we're talking about making a decision where the funding is constrained or not constrained. So if I say the funding is unconstrained, it's probably a government that's making the decision, and they can obviously borrow or they can tax to get in more money if they need to. So the mindset there is that they'll do any project if it's worth doing. Right? As long as it's a good project, they should just do it. Whereas if the funding is constrained, you might not do all the good projects. You might hope to do the best projects, but there might not be enough money to do all the projects that would be worth doing. So if funding is constrained, what we mean is that there's limited money available to spend on the project or the projects, and no more can be obtained in the time frame where you have to make your decision. So you are constrained. And so this could be a situation where you've got like a particular budget that's been allocated to a program. And in most of the BCA work that I have done historically, I'd say that's the most common result. We're often, you're in an environmental program, there's been, $100 million allocated to this program and we're going to spend it on projects. Which project should we spend it on? And there's no more money available. There's just that constrained 100 million or whatever it is. The next pair of circumstances is whether the projects that we're comparing are independent of each other or are not independent. So if they're independent of each other, what I mean by that is that the predicted results from the projects would be additive. If you did project A and you did project B, then the results, the overall benefits of that and the costs of that would be the sum of doing project A and the sum and project B. They don't affect each other. The benefits and the costs don't affect each other. So for example, if project A was a water pollution project in Western Australia and project B was a threatened species project in New South Wales, if you did project A, it clearly wouldn't affect the benefits or costs of doing project B, right? So they're independent projects. But in some situations, the projects that you're comparing are not independent. And the extreme version of that is if the projects are mutually exclusive. You've got a set of projects and they affect each other so much that you can only do one of them, right? So that would be a case where you had two different versions of the same project and you had to choose one or the other. So maybe you've got two versions of a project that differ in scale, or they differ in the mechanisms that you use within the project, but they're going to occur at the same place at the same time. So you're going to have to choose one or the other. You can't do both, right? So they're mutually exclusive projects. All right, so if you combine those two conditions into a little 2x2 matrix like this, you've got 4 circumstances where you might need different benefit cost analysis decision criteria. So let's look at those. So I'm going to work through the 4 different spots in this table. The first one is if you have independent projects and funding is unconstrained. So this is one that's often talked about in textbooks. It may not be recognised that that's what they're talking about, but this is the one that sort of often the recommendation is made. And in this case, the decision rule is you should fund all projects that have a net present value greater than 0 or a benefit cost ratio greater than 1 or an internal rate of return greater than the discount rate. And they're all the same. They all mean the same thing. So in this particular context, right, only in this context, right, only in this situation where you have independent projects and the funding is unconstrained, you could choose any of those three rules and you'd get the same result in terms of deciding whether or not to do a project. I've included internal rate of return in this thing, although it's a somewhat controversial decision rule. It's the one area where there is some debate about whether it should be used. Actually, it is quite widely used, but there are a number of papers and reports out there saying we shouldn't be using it because it's quite problematic. So I would only recommend using it in this scenario when you have independent projects and the funding is unconstrained. And even then, only if the costs are up front, not if it's benefits first and cost later, and only if there's only one change of sign. So there's benefits, 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 then cost, then benefits, benefits, benefits. There's no flipping back and forth between benefits and costs. Because if there is, you can get more than one internal rate of return for that stream of benefits or net benefits. And then you can cope with that, but it gets quite tricky. And so it's better not to bother in that situation, just use net present value or benefit cost ratio. So there's the first one. The second one is independent projects and funding constrained. So I'm going to go for the simplest example here for now. We'll change this later. The simplest case is where the funds are being allocated from a single pool. So there's only one constraint. And the question is, which subset of projects will deliver the greatest net present value overall? I'm also going to go for the simplest example, which is where we assume that the marginal project, the last project that we would fund, is scalable and that the benefits are proportional to its scale, right? So that's an important assumption. So if all of that's true, then the decision rule is you rank the projects by the benefit cost ratio and you select the highest ranked projects until the budget is exhausted. Specifically, you should not rank by net present value, which is sort of ironic because what you're trying to achieve is the maximum net present value. But this little illustration shows why that doesn't work when you apply it in this context. So I've got three example projects here, projects A, B, and C. I've got the present value of benefits, the present value of costs, the net present value, then the rank according to the net present value, the benefit cost ratio for each, and the rank according to the benefit cost ratio. You can see the ranks are the reverse, right? So one of them's wrong. If we say that the budget is constrained to $300 and ranked by net present value, then we would only choose to fund project C because that's the highest ranked project according to net present value. If we did that, the net present value we would get is 200. But if we rank by benefit cost ratio, then we could fund both A and B before we ran out of money, before we spent all of our $300. And then we can add up the net present value for both of those and we end up with 250. So this just sort of illustrates why it's just a sort of it doesn't prove it, but it sort of illustrates that relying on net present value as your ranking strategy in this particular context doesn't work. Benefit cost ratio performs better. And then the last two contexts are where you have mutually exclusive projects, either unconstrained or constrained. They're not very different in terms of the rule. If it's unconstrained, you just say, select the project with the highest net present value. If it's constrained, you say, select the project with the highest net present value that fits within the funding constraint. So very simple. That's just common. Those two are just common sense. So we have this little 2x2 block. And it's quite interesting that within that, we've got sort of 3, maybe 4 different rules about what you should do. So let's jump back to the textbooks and the guidelines. So one of the reasons that the textbooks or some of the textbooks and guidelines go wrong is that they don't recognise that there are these 4 different cases. And they start to make recommendations that come across as general recommendations that probably would be true for individual spots within that 2x2 matrix, but they don't clarify that they only apply within specific places. They say you should do this generally, and they miss out some of the spots within that 2x2 matrix. So it leads to problems. So let me just give you a few examples from the many that we've looked at of cases where that leads to things going a little bit off the rails. Here is the Victorian Department of Treasury and Finance, their benefit cost analysis guidelines, where I think this is an example of confusion and vagueness, They start by saying that using benefit cost ratio, if you do, an incorrect ranking may occur, especially when the projects are mutually exclusive. Well, that's true if you drop especially, right? Especially seems to imply that it might be true in the other case as well. And it's not true if they're not mutually exclusive, because then if they're not mutually exclusive, then benefit cost ratio works fine, right? So drop especially, and that's a true statement. The second bit is, nevertheless, the benefit cost ratio is a convenient quantitative evaluation tool when there are many investment proposals and resources are limited. They're sort of on the right track there, but convenient? Do we care about convenient? Not really. We want to be right. Okay, so I don't care that it's convenient. I want it to be correct. So that's sort of a bit confusing. And then the last one is, the results from the BCR should be considered with the net present value results during the decision-making process. What, always? They've just said that it's wrong sometimes. Couldn't we sort this out and recommend them in the right context, right? So this is sort of, they've said some things that are sort of true, but it's just confusing and unclear about when you do what. Here's another example of vagueness, and this time just outright error. This is the Commonwealth of Australia, the federal government's benefit cost analysis guidelines. They say that net present value is reliable in all circumstances. Well, that's just wrong. We've seen that. They say that the benefit cost ratio is not reliable in all circumstances. Well, that's true, but they don't say when it is reliable. So that's not as helpful as it could be. So that's still somewhat vague. And then a quote from a textbook. This is by Boardman et al., which is, I can't really tell, but it looks to me like this is probably the most widely used textbook around the world now. It's certainly got a high profile. It's Cambridge University Press, so I think it should be good. But they say, we recommend that analysts avoid using benefit cost ratios and rely instead on net benefits, or in other words, net present values, to rank projects. Well, that's just wrong, right? Just flat. That's their only advice. They don't, if there's no ifs or buts. It's a generic piece of advice. So that's just flat wrong. So then that raises the question, why? What's happened here? Why are these people, what have they got against, in particular, what do people have against benefit cost ratios, which is the one that normally gets, or most commonly gets sort of kicked out of consideration? Well, the first thing that you see is people, not everyone even says why they don't like benefit cost ratios. Some of them just say don't do it. But where they do say why we don't want you to do it, the most common reason is this, that benefit cost ratios are subject to manipulation. And this is the example that that Boardman textbook uses to illustrate the idea that benefit cost ratios are subject to manipulation. So they have a very trivial example. Suppose we've got an example where there's two groups in society and we've got a project. For one group in society, there's a benefit of $40 million. For the other group in society, there's a negative willingness to pay for this project. So they are made worse off by the project by $10 million. And then there's also expenditure of $10 million. So how do we calculate the benefit cost ratio in that case? And they give two examples. One possibility is that we could group together all the willingness to pays, including the positives and the negatives, in the numerator, and just put the cash expenditures in the denominator. So that's the first example there, BCR version 1. So if you did that, you end up with a benefit cost ratio of 3. Or we could group together all the things that look like, that could be interpreted as costs, right? Things that are sort of negative somehow, in which case you'd put the negative willingness to pay with the cash expenditure in the denominator, and then the BCR is 2. So that then Boardman et al. Say, so see, it doesn't work. You can get anything. It's all random. Who knows what you got? You can't even interpret it, right? So that's the sort of the sense that, so don't do it, right, basically. There's two problems with this line of argument. And again, you've got to look at it case by case around the 4 things. In the case where you have an unconstrained budget and independent projects, the rule that the benefit cost ratio should be greater than 1, right, that's the rule for that case, still works. The manipulation, if you start moving costs around between the numerator and the denominator, it does change the magnitude of the BCR, but it can never make it change from greater than 1 to less than 1, or from less than 1 to greater than 1. So in that particular circumstance, there's no problem with using BCR. But more importantly is the other one, where you have constrained budget and independent projects, which is the main place where you would recommend BCR and only BCR. So the counter argument here is that you can't just move around costs arbitrarily between the numerator and the denominator, because if our objective is to maximize the overall net present value, then mathematically there's only one place you can put the costs, and that is that the denominator must only contain the constrained costs, and the unconstrained costs would be subtracted from the numerator, right? It's only if you do that, and then you rank projects using that version of the BCR, will you get the maximum possible net present value from your portfolio of projects. So the idea that you can manipulate it is basically, anyone who says that is revealing that they don't understand the maths, right? Because this is the maths. There's another argument that's less commonly put about, but does appear from time to time. I think it's in the Australian government guidelines. It says that BCR is biased towards small projects. So if we're talking about mutually exclusive projects, again, we've got to break it down into these different categories. If we're talking about mutually exclusive projects, that's actually true. And that's one of the reasons why net present value is the right decision rule to use in that case. However, if we're talking about independent projects with a constrained budget, it's false. And in fact, it's almost the opposite, or it is the opposite. The situation there is that net present value is biased towards large projects. So we shouldn't use net present value, we should use BCR. So that just emphasizes that our thinking about this really needs to account for these 4 different circumstances. If you don't do that, you're likely to go wrong. So one of the things that we decided to do as a group is to look at all the textbooks and guidelines that we could find and see what they say. Just check how many of them get it right or reasonably right. How right do they get it? How many provide sound and complete advice, and so on. So that we've managed so far to find 56 textbooks and guidelines. Most of them are textbooks, but there's a fair number of government guidelines as well. And we're halfway through this, or a little bit over halfway through this process. We've looked at 29. Now I'm going to show you some preliminary results because they're really interesting. I want to stress that these are preliminary, and even the specific numbers I show you for these 29 might change, because what we're going to do is have 2 of us look at each of them, and so far we've only had 1 person look at each of them. And I'm going to give you some details in a minute, but I'm going to start with a sort of an overall summary where I'll give you a score out of 4 for what I'm going to say, what is the average score out of 4 for all of the 29 that we've looked at. And this is how I'm going to score them. We give each one a point if they say, if all projects are mutually exclusive, use net present value to select the best project that fits within the budget. We'll get 1 point if they say, if all projects are independent and the budget is unconstrained, then they're all equivalent, use any of them you like. They'll get 1 point for saying, if all the projects are independent and budget is constrained, only use the BCR to rank projects, provided that they're not lumpy, they're divisible. And they'll get 1 point for saying, if all projects are independent and the budget's unconstrained, do the right thing about where you put the costs, only constrain costs in the denominator. All right, so now I want to ask you to have a guess at what you think the average result is across the 29 that we've looked at. So those of you who are online, you could go into the chat and put in the number between 0 and 4. So do you think that they're all correct? Well, you know they're not all correct because I've already given you some examples where they're not. But are they closest to 4 correct? Are they closest to 3? Are they closest to 2 on average? Are they closest to 1, or are they closest to 0? So I'm going to ask the group people in the room in a minute to put up their hands, and everybody has to put up their hand for one of those numbers. But before I ask that, I want to emphasize that we're talking about here about textbooks and government guidelines. So they should be 4, right? They all should be 4. Okay. So in the room, yes, Chumbo's got a question.
So far, on average, is about 1.5.
Okay, online. Okay. So in the room, put your hand up if you think it's closest to 4, closest to 3, closest to 2, 4, closest to 1. Another 4, closest to 0. 4. Okay, it's pretty even. So how are we looking online, Jumbo?
Now it's a bit lower than 1.5.
Okay, it's just under 1.5. Okay, well, I guess you can sort of tell by my smirk and by the general tenor of what I've been saying that the answer is low. The answer is 0.9. Don't you think that's fairly extraordinary? It's amazing.
You have so many different categories though, and how many of those textbooks were introductory and?
They are specialised textbooks in benefit cost analysis. There's no excuse in my mind. I think they should be damned. They should be damned. You know, really. So this is the breakdown of the results. You can see 24 of the 29 scored less, 1 or less. 11 scored 0. 2 scored 2.5. They're the best 2 on the screen that we found so far. There's more to look at.
How do they score a fraction? How do they score a fraction?
For some of them they're sort of partly right, so we got them half. We gave them half a mark. Yeah.
Out of the 4, which ones tend to be? Obviously, there are some that are commonly achieved. Which ones are they?
Commonly what?
Out of the 4, which ones do they get?
Oh, okay, yes. The next one. Okay, so they're bad at all of them, basically. So the first one recognises the distinction between constraints and unconstrained. 8, clearly. 7, a bit. 14, clearly not. Recognises the distinction between independent and mutually exclusive. 5, yes. 17, no. Recommend BCR for ranking independent projects when there's a constraint. Only 5. 7 sort of around the area. 17, no. This is about the last. Says that BCR can be manipulated. Says that it's biased. Not that many, but a few. This is the really interesting one. The last one gets the benefit cost ratio formula right if part of the cost is constrained. None. Not 1. Okay, so that's a bit depressing. What about if you start to factor in some more realistic complexities? Because it's a lot more complex than that. There's all sorts of other things that could go that you might need to account for. Yes?
Quick question. Does this mean that they're not being that explicit, or that they're actually wrong in what they recommend? There's 2 different.
Yeah, so some of them are actually outright wrong, and some of them just don't say, right? They don't say, so the way I worded that was quite specific. I said, they will get a point if they say that if all projects are independent and the budget is constrained, only use BCR to rank the projects. If they don't say that, they don't get a point, right? I don't think they're getting better. Possibly they're getting worse. Yeah. I think some of the better ones, like the issue was actually sorted out in the 50s. And since the 50s, there's been not many people have got reasonably good sets of advice. Okay, so I started by giving you 2 scenarios, but actually there's other things that you might need to account for too. For example, you might want to account for the fact that projects don't scale linearly. Remember I said the marginal project should scale linearly? You might want to account for the fact that projects could be binary, they could be lumpy. You can't just scale it up and down at all. You might want to account for the fact that the projects might be subject to more than one constraint, right? There might be a constraint on the upfront funding and then a different constraint on the maintenance funding, or a different sort of constraint entirely, a constraint on the availability of the expertise that you need to implement a set of projects. You might want to account for the fact that there are dependent projects. So I've gone for the extremes, independent projects or mutually exclusive projects, but there's shades in between that where one project partially affects the benefits of another project. Or you might want to account for the fact that you've got this long list of projects that you're working on or you're thinking about, and that within that long list, there could be a mix of independent, dependent, and mutually exclusive projects. Not just all one. Like in my simple 2x2, I've got everything's the same type of project. And That's not necessarily realistic. So what about then? So within our project team, we've been working on a more comprehensive set of advice, which I'm not going to go through now because it will take too long. This will end up in a paper. Relatively little of this appears in the literature. That's the 4 that I've already walked you through. But you can see there's a bunch of other things that we say as well. So, we've got down on the left-hand side, we've got additional rows for projects being independent or for a mix of projects. And across the columns, we've got an additional column for having more than one constraint. The other thing to observe is that most of the additional recommendations or most of the additional decision rules that come in when you start to talk about these additional realistic complexities mean that none of those criteria work. And actually the only way to choose the best set of projects is using constrained optimization. You actually need to build a linear programming model or a non-linear programming model or an integer programming model, depending on the nature of your problem. Okay, so that's pretty interesting. That hardly ever gets said anywhere that I've seen, but realistically, that's the advice. And the other thing that I'd observe is it's actually not that hard to do. It's particularly now with pretty good quality non-linear optimization and integer optimization available in Excel. You'd have to have a pretty big list of projects for it not to be possible to optimize them just in Excel. All right, so what's our next steps? We're going to complete our audit of the textbooks and the guidelines, publish a paper and wait for the abuse. I'm pretty confident there'll be some. But let me finish with some closing observations. This has been a really interesting experience and surprising. Like, it takes a lot of work to do a good benefit cost analysis. It's not a trivial exercise by any stretch, but many people are using bad decision criteria to make decisions at the end of doing all that work. Some are even using internal rate of return, which is pretty inexcusable given the amount of criticism that there is about that out there. It doesn't work in any of those contexts except for one, and even then only in certain conditions. So really nobody should be using internal rate of return. But in certain areas, like if you look at the literature on the benefit cost analysis of research, almost all those results are reported as using internal rate of returns. So myths and misconceptions persist and have persisted and continue on. There's really no advice about the complex cases, almost no advice about that last table I showed with a lot more different contexts. And nobody's complaining. All this is going on. It's a catastrophe, right? It's absolutely disastrous. No one's complaining. No one seems to have noticed that we've completely gone off the rails with what we've done with our decision criteria for benefit cost analysis, with the exception of complaints about using internal rate of return. Okay. Questions? We'll do some questions in the room and then we'll see if there's any questions online. Jacob?
So how often is funding truly unconstrained? Like, how often do we have projects that we're analyzing where there is no constraint?
I think you can argue that if a project was really beneficial at the discount rate of the interest rate that you could borrow at, then, and you don't have a constraint on borrowing, then funding is unconstrained. Right? And for government, well, I guess there's a time frame in there, isn't it? If you're trying to make a decision now, it's probably constrained, almost always. But if you can make a decision that on a big project and it's not going to implement it for some years, then in a sense,
so things like
it could be for the federal government. It could be unconstrained.
Things like blue sky projects.
Yeah, big infrastructure projects or something.
Okay.
Yeah. Mary?
Well, first, are there any students with questions? Have you analysed decisions that have been made? This is analysing textbooks and guidelines.
Yeah, that's a good question.
Because I'm wondering if, because it, like I said before, it's just there's nothing that's really surprising.
Yeah.
But I've never looked really at textbooks, but more on what makes sense when you're in the decision process.
Yeah,
It's
so
pretty obvious when you have a constrained budget, but you have way more experience giving like governance advice, and do they actually use the wrong criteria to make their decision?
that's a good question. I don't know the answer. So Matt's question for online was, have we looked at what people actually use? I think that's one question, and we don't know the answer to that. And then there's another sort of related question. What difference does it, this is from me, what difference does it make if they use the wrong one? How bad is that? Haven't looked at that either. So that's another interesting question that we could
Or your
potentially,
ABC example,
yeah.
that really easy one makes that.
Yeah, but you can see it in that
And
case,
you
yeah.
can
Yeah.
your work in Victoria with
Yeah.
the nutrient pollution, where
Yep.
you could probably have data.
Yeah, we could pull out a few examples and see what difference it makes to use the wrong criteria. But as a general comment about how bad is this for the discipline as a whole, I couldn't say. Another thing that would be interesting would be to survey economists in general and see what they say about what should go in the 2x2. That would be fun to do too. Any other questions? I mean,
That's a very interesting view. I think, yeah, because most textbooks will not go to make the distinction that you have made about the different types of investments, whether they are mutually exclusive or not. I think they just normally give a general advice.
Yeah.
Okay, but my observation in your formula, because you compute your net present value as just the present value of the benefits minus the present value of the cost.
yeah,
But ideally, when you think about that equation of present value, the assumption is that the streams of income starts to come one period after. So that when we are discounting, we're discounting to the point where we have where the project begins, the streams of income starts to come in. So the general understanding, my understanding of the literature, is that that's the reason then when we look at the formula, we normally take the present value, we have to discount everything, then we have to subtract the initial cost. So the way you put it is almost like you have lumped all the streams of costs, you have discounted them, and then you have just put the initial. So I'm not sure whether you have put the initial cost there. Is that not confusing? Because I don't think that is the correct thing.
I would include the initial cost within the present value. If there's a cost at time zero,
Yeah.
then that would be included in your calculation of the present value of the costs.
But when you come to think about then what's the meaning of the present value of computing that?
So I'm calculating
Is that correct?
the aggregate. So the present value of cost is my so perhaps I should clarify for people online. So Amin is asking about the details of the calculation of the present value of cost, and is questioning how you would handle costs at time zero. And I know when you use the present value, the net present value formula in Excel, you do have to separately add in the cost at time zero from the discounted cost for every subsequent year. So I would be doing that. Yeah, Michael.
Just as a question, Tilak, I don't know what two questions. Steve and Sam. Okay, also an early one. Tilak want to ask Tilak want to say it rather than
Tilak, do you want to unmute yourself and ask the question? If not, we'll read it out.
What happens when funding is contained, when the funding is the problem? So NHT, where they basically had to spend all the money.
Okay. Yeah, that's a beauty. Yeah, so the question was, what happens if you're in a situation where there's a lot of pressure to spend the money and often to spend it quickly, and TLAC refers to NHT, and I've certainly have been involved in, my great memory was being involved in the salinity program, where someone from New South Wales once said to me that their problem was how fast can you shovel? And so I guess that's a different context, really. Like, we're not in that situation. Whoever's imposing that constraint is not. Well, I guess you could look on that as another constraint. You could impose that as another constraint, that certain amounts of money have to be spent by certain periods of time, and you could try and optimize within that. If you did it that way, it would be possible if you had the information, but you'd have to build an optimization model. You wouldn't be able to use any of the the simple criteria. You'd have to actually sort of represent it, the constraints and the time frame, and do it that way. You could.
Waste the money wisely.
Yeah, that's right. So Michael Burton's comment was, in doing it that way, you could hopefully waste the money wisely, or waste it in a way that was less wasteful than it might otherwise be. And then I think there's another question from Steve. Chumba, do you want to read that one?
Steve basically asking the lack of compliance that represents there's a lack of communication between theorists and practitioners.
Yeah. Yeah, but I don't think this is even theorists. I mean, so the question is this, I'm taking it as the question being, is this because there's a lack of communication between theorists and practitioners? But we're not even really talking about practitioners. We're talking about people who are advising practitioners who ought to make it their responsibility to get on top of the theory, you would have thought. So maybe there's some of that, but I don't think that's the main problem. So let's ask that question. What would anyone like to speculate? I don't know the answer to this. Would anyone like to speculate how we've got to this? Why is it that we've got all of these textbooks and guidelines sort of repeating, they're sort of copying each other, I think, repeating advice, some of which is quite wrong. Mary?
Well, I think it's just simplicity.
Simplicity.
Yeah. Not having enough time to dedicate 10 years, you said, or how many years was it, to thinking about the problem, and therefore just basing it on whatever the previous person had said.
Maybe, but if you look at, some of these textbooks are very big. They cover a lot of ground. Like that Boardman textbook is 400 pages.
And
they've got
specifically on DCA, so I think those people have no excuse.
Yeah, those people have no excuse. Yeah.
But David,
yes, go on.
I was going to just draw on something that is in the comments here, and that's also my experience as well, is that your objective that you set out is never once been the objective in any analysis that I have ever provided government in 20 years.
Yeah.
So in the one sense, I don't disagree, but you're saying, like, why is this? Well, in some sense, it doesn't matter. Like, and I'm sure that there is everyone that's ever in practice delivered these for government has worked on the same way. Like, the objective was not how you framed it, and then the potential costs of that lack of clarity are maybe also not so much there.
Yeah. Okay.
And I actually have one that's a comment and a question just on, so we have negative real interest rates these days. The US gives updated values every year. The guidelines here seem to be pretty static. I just wondered if you wanted to make a comment on any of that gives you any conceptual issues, or does all this still hold in this world of negative real interest rates?
I haven't thought about that question. I think at least the stuff I've talked about today, I think still holds. But the whole world of negative real interest rates, if that results in negative discount rates, is something I've not grappled with. But your first comment, absolutely, of course, government programs have a variety of objectives, and maximising the overall net present value of the investment is not necessarily front and centre. I think that there is from, I guess my experience would be that people do want to pay, they would like to achieve more valuable outcomes if they could, as long as we're also achieving the political objectives. So I think that when we give the advice, we're giving the advice in the textbooks and the guidelines as if that's the thing we're trying to maximise. And so that at least ought to be right within its own terms. So, yeah. But I guess you do make a point, which sort of goes back to Marit's earlier comment about how much difference does it make. If indeed all of the decisions are totally polluted by other considerations and no one is going for any of these objectives in reality, then it doesn't matter, right? Who cares? But hopefully we do chip away and try and make small inroads towards achieving better social outcomes than would otherwise be the case. And so I still think knowing this stuff is helpful, at least at the margin. At least the textbook should be right. Okay, any more online before going inside again?
No.
Ram?
I was just wondering, as you presented, that thinking about how governments or people make decisions, particularly, let's say, from government's point of view, the consideration that you presented into that detail is really something we should share with the students or know what needs to be considered. But the practical world is quite different, as James mentioned. That's what I was wondering. Those benefits, costs, whether discounted or undiscounted, that is somewhere, and the political thinking overrule the decisions, and all this hard work that people do and put forward with the logic doesn't have a high buy-in in many cases.
Yeah.
So how can we frame this problem in such a way that there might be some political buy-in of this set of analysis?
I think that's a separate issue that is very important. You know, we've, as economists, as a discipline, we've been pushing for more efficient, appropriate decision-making since we emerged as a discipline, with mixed levels of success, of course. But I think it's, BCRs are still very widely used and in some situations are required. James mentioned to me yesterday that in some situations that BCRs are required to be done. It's not required that they have a positive net present value, they just have to be done. But nevertheless, they are required to be done. And so, we can just keep pushing, I guess. I haven't got a better solution to that. My last 20 years has been pushing away, chipping away at trying to get better decisions made in various contexts. And sometimes you feel like you've made some inroads, and sometimes you realise that you haven't. That's just, I guess that's life. Chumba.
I think it's still very useful and important to get the textbook right in the first place. Because people get properly trained, in the end, some of those will end up being in the government department.
Yeah.
Even marginally, they can help better decision making.
So Chumba is saying we should get the textbooks right, because even if it's only a certain number of people that use them correctly, at least someone will in the long run, and so that's worth doing. Yeah. Jacob?
I think one of the things that's hard about this that Merritt spoke to is that we don't know what the cost, we don't have a good idea of what the cost of using the wrong decision criteria is. We don't know the magnitude of how big of an issue is this. And so without having that type of gauge of magnitude, it's hard to be able to sell it to a government agency of, well, you shouldn't be doing it that way, you should be doing it this way.
I hypothesize that, say, the ERF is pretty.
Yeah. What's your hypothesis for the ERF?
Oh, it's a complete waste of money.
Yeah, mine too. All right.
I think one issue is when you got CDA compared to all the other things economists do, it's an output for outsiders, not for economists.
That's an interesting comment. So I take what his comment is that the benefit cost analysis is essentially an output for outsiders, not an output that's embraced and greatly focused on by economists.
A lot of economics is for self-consumption. So
yeah, okay.
So it doesn't.
So then, therefore, it gets less scrutiny, perhaps. That might be how some of these areas have maintained.
Keep ongoing, because you don't get PhD students looking into this.
Yeah.
It's considered a sort of not a very sophisticated technique.
Yeah.
So it's not at the frontier.
Yeah.
It's very
Okay.
important. So
yeah. So BCA is not considered a sophisticated technique, so it doesn't get the actual details of it. Don't get a lot of attention.
That's one thing. The other thing is it's convenient, but it's not very clear.
Okay, it's convenient that it's not very clear. Why would it be convenient?
It's convenient that it's not consistent. So when people get hired to something, if they have some flexibility in how
Okay.
they formulate it,
It gives decision makers an option to look at different criteria and choose the one that they prefer the answer from. Okay.
so you can make that your own answer.
Yeah. Okay.
It's always argued that economists, we don't agree.
Yeah, but and I think, you know, the ones I mentioned at the beginning, I think discount rates, handling of equity, there's legitimate disagreements about those. There's no legitimate disagreement about this. This is just absolutely right and wrong, as long as you accept that the objective is to maximize overall net present. It's just math. It's just maths, right? So I think it's less legitimate in this case. Are you going to ask a question?
I was just wondering, are economists ever involved in these guidelines that are written by
Yeah.
states? Okay, so
They are written by governments who economists who work for government.
Okay, so I was gonna say my experience seems really heavily linked to procurement, and then all of a sudden it's quite dominated by lawyers. And I was wondering if that could be one of the reasons why
No.
the economics is getting weakened there.
No, I've read all of, in reasonable detail, I've read all of the guidelines for the different states and federally in Australia and New Zealand and a good chunk of the UK one. So for my sins. And they're clearly written by economists. There's no doubt they're written by economists, not by anybody else.
All the more reason to get the teaching resources.
Yeah, right. I think in order to tackle this problem, the first thing is I agree with Sumbo. If the textbook, at least what are we missing? If you do in this particular way versus the other way, if we make people aware, slowly it will have some impact down the track.
Okay, so the team, we've got a job. Our little team that's mentioned on the screen at the moment. We have to go and evangelize to all the textbook authors that we can find who have an actively published book and ask them to improve it in their next edition. Yeah, well, we'll get our paper published first, and then we'll send it. But then we'll send it to them. They'll come to me. Yeah. Okay.
And we should be careful when we write one paper or two papers.
Okay.
I don't think you should write two. You should write one. You should write two, because the first part you presented is very clear.
Yeah.
But when you go to the second part, it becomes more complex. But
okay.
The
We
point
could.
is so clear. You want to write the first paper.
So up until the point where we've said everyone's getting this wrong just with the simple version, and then stop that and have a more
complex.
Okay, so Takriti is suggesting we have two papers, one with the simple version and then the last big table, which will take quite a bit of explaining anyway, in a separate thing. Yeah, okay, maybe we'll think about that. Thanks.
One comment from Sandra, basically giving you a new example of guidance, government report from New Zealand government. That's on the comment section, and another two comments basically saying that having some definite guidance on how to treat lines and items in the numerator and denominator is very valuable.
Yeah.
Clarification provided on unconstrained was very good. So there's some comments on.
Okay. Thank you for the online comments. That's great. All right, maybe we should wrap it up there. So this is a project that we'll keep going with, and there will be a publication or at some point. Presumably we can get it past referees. So keep a lookout for that. All right, thank you for your interest.
The MP public where you get published CBA stuff and try to show
What difference it would make. Yeah, that's another project that we could do. Actually, go and get a bunch of finished benefit cost analysis, get the numbers, and see what difference it would make. Yeah. Yeah.
Can I go? I just want to save the comments.
Okay.
Yeah,
it's good.
I think the only thing I found which is correct based on.
Oh, no.
Is,
Well, I don't know who's the host,
Stefan,
Jumbo.
because he got it right. I have my lecture notes and I was doing finance. Everything is correct. The only thing he did not talk about is the constraint. I've never seen that, but everything else I think is very.
That's impressive because it's so hard to find.
It's so hard to find. Yeah.
Hang on. And that's only in lecture notes.